Origins, 1945 to 1949. Post-World War II conferences. Yalta Conference, February 1945. The Yalta Conference was a crucial meeting between Franklin D. Roosevelt, USA, Winston Churchill, UK, and Joseph Stalin, USSR, to discuss the post-war order. The leaders agreed to divide Germany into occupation zones and establish the United Nations. However, differences over the future of Eastern Europe began to surface, with Stalin insisting on Soviet influence over Eastern European countries to create a buffer zone against potential future Western aggression. Potsdam Conference, July-August 1945. At Potsdam, the Allied leaders met to finalize decisions about post-war Europe. The conference exposed significant disagreements, particularly regarding the treatment of Germany and the extent of Soviet control over Eastern Europe. The lack of a common vision for Europe's future marked the beginning of the geopolitical rivalry between the East and West. Iron Curtain. Churchill's speech, 1946. On March 5, 1946, Winston Churchill delivered a speech in Fulton, Missouri, declaring that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe, dividing the free West from the communist East. This speech underscored the growing ideological divide and called for a strong Western alliance to counter Soviet expansionism. Truman Doctrine, 1947. Containment Policy. On March 12, 1947, President Harry Truman articulated the Truman Doctrine, stating that the U.S. would support free peoples resisting subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. This policy of containment aimed to limit Soviet influence and prevent the spread of communism, marking the start of an active American role in global affairs to counter the Soviet Union. Marshall Plan, 1948. Economic aid to Europe, officially known as the European Recovery Program, the Marshall Plan was announced by Secretary of State George Marshall in 1947 and implemented in 1948. It provided over $12 billion, equivalent to more than $100 billion today, in economic assistance to help rebuild Western European economies devastated by World War II. The plan also aimed to stabilize these countries to prevent communism from gaining traction. Early Cold War, 1949 to 1962. Berlin Blockade and Airlift, 1948 to 1949. First major crisis. In June 1948, the Soviet Union blocked all ground access to West Berlin, hoping to force the Allies out and gain control of the entire city. In response, the U.S. and its allies organized the Berlin Airlift, supplying West Berlin by air with food, fuel, and other essential goods for almost a year. This operation demonstrated the Western commitment to defending Berlin and countered Soviet aggression without direct military conflict. NATO Formation, 1949. Collective Security. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, was established on April 4, 1949, as a military alliance between the US, Canada, and Western European nations to counter Soviet aggression. NATO's principle of collective defense meant that an attack on one member would be considered an attack on all, creating a powerful deterrent against Soviet military actions in Europe. Chinese Civil War and Korean War. Chinese Communist Victory, 1949. The Chinese Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong, defeated the nationalist forces of Chiang Kai-shek, who fled to Taiwan. The establishment of the People's Republic of China significantly shifted the global balance of power, with the world's most populous country joining the communist bloc. Korean War, 1950 to 1953. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces, backed by the USSR and China, invaded South Korea. The United States, under the UN banner, intervened to support South Korea. The war saw significant fighting, including Chinese intervention on behalf of North Korea. It ended in an armistice on July 27, 1953, maintaining the division of Korea along the 38th parallel, and solidifying the Cold War divide in Asia. Arms race and space race. Nuclear arms competition. Following the U.S. development and use of atomic bombs in World War II, the Soviet Union successfully tested its own atomic bomb in 1949. This ignited a nuclear arms race, with both superpowers developing increasingly powerful weapons, including hydrogen bombs. The concept of mutually assured destruction, MAD, emerged, wherein both sides possessed the capability to destroy each other, deterring direct conflict. Space race, the competition extended to space exploration, with significant milestones such as the Soviet launch of Sputnik in 1957, the first artificial satellite. This achievement shocked the U.S. and led to increased investments in science and technology. The U.S. responded with the Apollo program, culminating in the moon landing on July 20, 1969, when astronaut Neil Armstrong became the first human to set foot on the moon. Height of the Cold War, 1962 to 1979. Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962. Nuclear standoff. In October 1962, the discovery of Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the U.S. coast, led to a 13-day confrontation that brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. President John F. Kennedy imposed a naval blockade around Cuba and demanded the removal of the missiles. After intense negotiations, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev agreed to withdraw the missiles in exchange for a U.S. promise not to invade Cuba and the secret removal of U.S. missiles from Turkey. The crisis underscored the dangers of the nuclear arms race and led to improved communication between the superpowers. Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975. Anti-communist intervention. The Vietnam War was a prolonged and controversial conflict in which the U.S. aimed to prevent the spread of communism in Southeast Asia by supporting the South Vietnamese government against the communist North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. The war escalated significantly in the 1960s, becoming increasingly unpopular in the U.S. due to high casualties and media coverage. The U.S. eventually withdrew its forces in 1973, and South Vietnam fell to the north in 1975, leading to the unification of Vietnam under communist control. Détente, 1970s. Easing tensions. The period of détente saw improved relations between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, characterized by diplomatic efforts to reduce tensions and the risk of nuclear war. Key agreements included the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT-I, in 1972, which limited the number of strategic ballistic missile launchers, and the Anti-Ballistic Missile, ABM, Treaty, which restricted the development of missile defense systems. The Helsinki Accords of 1975 further improved East-West relations by addressing issues of security, economic cooperation, and human rights. Late Cold War, 1979 to 1991. Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, 1979. Renewed tensions. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979 aimed to support the Afghan Communist government against a growing insurgency. The U.S. viewed this as an expansion of Soviet influence and responded by supporting the Afghan Mujahideen with weapons and training. The conflict became a prolonged and costly war for the Soviet Union, contributing to its eventual decline. Reagan era, 1981 to 1989. Hardline policies. President Ronald Reagan adopted a tough stance against the Soviet Union, describing it as the evil empire. His administration increased defense spending and initiated the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, a missile defense system intended to protect the U.S. from nuclear attacks. Reagan's policies aimed to pressure the Soviet economy, which was already struggling, and to roll back communist influence around the world. Gorbachev reforms, 1985 to 1991. Glasnost and Perestroika. Mikhail Gorbachev became the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in 1985 and introduced significant reforms. Glasnost, openness, allowed for greater transparency, freedom of expression, and the press, while Perestroika, restructuring, aimed to reform the stagnant Soviet economy by introducing limited market mechanisms. These reforms unintentionally weakened the Soviet grip on Eastern Europe and contributed to rising nationalist movements within the Soviet republics. Fall of communism in Eastern Europe, 1989. Revolutions and liberation. A wave of peaceful revolutions swept through Eastern Europe in 1989, leading to the fall of communist regimes. Key events included the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989, symbolizing the end of the division between East and West Germany. Other countries, including Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Romania, also saw the collapse of their communist governments, largely due to popular uprisings and the withdrawal of Soviet support. Dissolution of the Soviet Union, 1991. End of the Cold War. Internal economic and political pressures, combined with nationalist movements within Soviet republics, led to the dissolution of the Soviet Union on December 26, 1991. The Soviet republics declared independence, and the USSR ceased to exist. The end of the Soviet Union marked the official end of the Cold War, with the US emerging as the world's sole superpower. Key themes and impact. Ideological conflict. Capitalism versus communism. The Cold War was fundamentally a battle of ideologies. The US championed capitalism, democracy, and individual freedoms, while the Soviet Union promoted communism, a centrally planned economy, and one-party rule. This ideological conflict shaped global alliances, with each superpower supporting governments and movements that aligned with their respective ideologies. Proxy wars. Global battlegrounds. Many regional conflicts were influenced by Cold War dynamics, as both superpowers supported opposing sides to expand their influence without direct confrontation. Notable examples include the Korean War, Vietnam War, and conflicts in Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East. These proxy wars often resulted in significant devastation and loss of life, exacerbating local tensions and leaving lasting legacies. Nuclear threat. Mutually assured destruction, MAD. The presence of nuclear weapons and the doctrine of MAD meant that both superpowers had the capability to annihilate each other, deterring direct conflict but creating a constant threat of nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis highlighted the dangers of nuclear brinkmanship and led to efforts to establish better communication and arms control agreements between the superpowers. Global influence. Cultural and technological competition. The Cold War spurred significant advancements in technology and space exploration, driven by the competition between the US and USSR. The space race led to landmark achievements such as the first human in space, Yuri Gagarin, and the moon landing. The arms race accelerated technological development in both military and civilian sectors. The cultural competition included propaganda, media, and public diplomacy, with both sides seeking to showcase their societal models as superior. The Cold War's legacy continues to shape international relations, political ideologies, and military strategies. It was a defining period of the 20th century, leaving an indelible mark on global history and influencing contemporary geopolitical dynamics. The ideological, political, and military lessons of the Cold War remain relevant as the world navigates new challenges and conflicts in the 21st century.